There is an address in San Gabriel, California, 1655 West Brooks Avenue, that holds a clue to one of the strangest stories in American industrial history. The building is still there. It hasn't been torn down. It hasn't been left to rot. The parking lot is filled with trucks. The loading docks are busy. If you stand outside the door and breathe in, you'll smell vinegar. You'll smell garlic. You'll smell chili peppers by the ton, because this is where they make sriracha now. The rooster on the label, the red bottle on every table in every restaurant from here to Maine. Inside those walls, workers tend vats and process peppers and fill millions of bottles with hot sauce. But for 30 years before that, from 1955 to 1987, different workers came to this same address and made something else entirely. They made hula hoops, they made frisbees, they packaged slip and slides in flat yellow rolls and stacked them on pallets to be loaded onto trucks heading for every toy store and five and dime in America. They made the Superball, that impossible little black sphere that could bounce over a 3-story building if you threw it hard enough. They came to work in a complex of 8 buildings sprawling across 171,000 square feet, the size of 3 football fields, and they made summer happen for 25 years. The company was Wham-O, and if you grew up in America in the 1950s, 1960s, or 1970s, you touched something they made. You almost certainly loved it. So here is the question worth asking. Here is the thing that pulls at you when you stand in that parking lot and breathe in the smell of hot sauce where the smell of warm polyethylene used to live. How does the company that invented the Frisbee, that sold 100 million hula hoops, and put the Superball in the White House, and in a way that will become clear, gave the Super Bowl its name? How does that company end up a trademark on a Chinese corporate balance sheet? How does fun disappear? The answer begins, as so many American stories do, with 2 young men who had no idea what they were building. It begins in a garage. It begins with a slingshot. Richard Churned was born in San Gabriel in 1925. Arthur Mellin, everyone called him Spud, was born the year before in 1924. Would either make them very successful, or would either make them very successful or get them into considerable trouble. They were constitutionally incapable of sitting still. They both went to USC. They both came out restless. They both looked at the world of conventional employment, the desk, the boss, the slow climb, and felt something close to dread. So they built a slingshot. That's not a metaphor. They built an actual slingshot from ashwood, because they were falconers. They hunted with birds of prey, and they needed something to fling raw meat scraps up into the air for the birds to catch. The slingshot they built was powerful enough to do the job. It was also, as it turned out, powerful enough to launch a company. They called it the Wham-O slingshot. The name came from the sound it made when the shot connected with a target, a hard, flat impact that you could feel in your back teeth. Wham-O. They registered the company in 1948, working out of the Churned family garage in South Pasadena. Their startup capital was modest by any measure. 2 young men, a saw they'd bought from Sears on the installment plan, a belief that other people must want what they wanted and not much else. They advertised in Field and Stream and other sporting magazines, targeting the same hunters and outdoorsmen who might understand a well-made slingshot. They filled orders from the garage. When the garage got too small, they moved to a rented space in Alhambra. And when Alhambra got too small, when the orders kept coming for slingshots and boomerangs and blowguns and the other peculiar items that made up their early catalog, they moved to San Gabriel, to the plant on West Brooks Avenue in 1955. Here's what matters about those early years, though it's easy to miss it in the biography. Churned and Mellin were not inventors, not in the traditional sense. They didn't have a laboratory. They didn't have an engineering team. They had instead something rarer and in some ways more valuable, an almost preternatural sense for what would delight people. They went where people played. They watched. They listened. They were constitutionally drawn to anything that seemed fun in a way they couldn't quite explain yet. Churned was known to linger in toy stores for hours, not shopping, just watching which items kids reached for, which ones they put back, which ones made them stop mid-stride. Mellin traveled. He went on safaris to Africa, where he once discovered a species of fish that laid its eggs in the mud, waiting for rain. He came back with an aquarium kit built around those eggs, which he sold as instant fish. It was a spectacular failure. But the impulse to find the strange, the new, the inexplicable, that impulse was exactly right. They made mistakes constantly, and they almost never let the mistakes stop them. There was the do-it-yourself bomb shelter kit they sold at the height of the Cold War for $119. There were the plastic great white shark teeth they rushed to market the month Jaws opened in theaters. There was the limbo dance kit of 1962, time to a fad that was already fading. Churned and Mellin threw products at the wall with what sometimes looked like reckless abandon, and they shrugged at the ones that didn't didn't stick. What kept them going, what kept the company alive through the misses, was the quality of the hits. And the first real hit wasn't theirs at all. A man named Fred Morrison had been selling a flying disc from the back of his station wagon for years. Morrison was a building inspector by trade, a former Air Force pilot by history, a tinkerer by nature. He'd been working on the idea since the late 1940s, a plastic disc designed to fly with unusual stability, which he sold under names like the Whirlaway and the Pluto Platter, leaning into the post-war fascination with UFOs. He drove up and down the California coastline and sold them directly to people on the beach. Nur and Mellin found him in 1957 and bought the rights. They hired Ed Hedrick, Steady Ed, they called him, a World War II veteran who had spent part of the war spying on Nazi troop movements, and who had, apparently, a gift for redirecting his intensely methodical nature from intelligence work to aerodynamics. Hedrick redesigned the disc, adding the concentric rings that improved its stability in flight. Then he did something arguably more important than the redesign. He went to college campuses and paid students to throw the disc in public. He understood, before most people had a name for the concept, that the right kind of visible enthusiasm spreads like a virus. Nur and Mellin renamed the disc the Frisbee. The name came, depending on which story you believe, from a cartoon character called Mr. Frisbee, or from the Frisbee Baking Company in Connecticut, whose pie tins students at Yale had been tossing back and forth for decades. Both explanations may be true, neither really matters. What matters is the name fit, short, memorable, fun to say. And the disc caught on so thoroughly that it outlasted the company that made it. But the Frisbee was a slow burn. It took years to build the sport culture around it, to sanctify ultimate and disc golf and the competitive circuits that would eventually bring the World Frisbee Disc Championships to the Rose Bowl. The Frisbee became what it became through patience and cultivation. The hula hoop was nothing like that. The hula hoop was a bomb going off. To understand what Wham-O built, you have to understand what plastic was in 1958, not what plastic is now. Ubiquitous, contemptible, the villain in a million environmental documentaries, but what it was then, when it was still a miracle. Plastic in the post-war years was possibility. It was the material that the war had built. The engineers and chemists who'd been working on military applications were now turning to consumer goods, and they were finding that this category of synthetic polymers could become almost anything, pliable or rigid, transparent or opaque, cheap enough to throw away, a substance you could mold into any shape the mind could conceive. Nur and Mellin understood this before most toy companies did. The traditional toy world was wood and metal and painted tin. The rocking horse, the fire truck, the train set. Wham-O looked at plastic and saw a different kind of toy, simple, colorful, durable, light, shapeable, and cheap enough that a child's allowance could cover it. It was like a new medium, Tim Walsh, a Wham-O historian, said years later. You'd never see a company making both toys and weapons now, but they wanted to see what they could do with it. What they could do with it, it turned out, was create the largest toy fad in American history. In the spring of 1957, an Australian visiting California mentioned, almost in passing, that children in his home country used bamboo rings in gym class, twirling them around their waists for exercise. Nur and Mellin heard this and were intrigued. They were also, initially, baffled. They couldn't quite figure out what was meant by twirling it around your waist until someone demonstrated the motion. When they understood, they moved fast. They made prototype hoops from a plastic called Marlex, a high-density polyethylene that the Phillips Petroleum Company had invented in 1954 and was, at that moment, desperately struggling to sell. Phillips had invested $50 million developing Marlex. Their sales reps had been traveling the country looking for anyone who wanted high-density polyethylene and finding almost no one. The plastic was technically superior, high melting point, good tensile strength, flexible, but the market hadn't caught up to it yet. Wham-O was about to change that. They went to Pasadena Elementary School playgrounds in the spring of 1958 with their prototypes. The hoops were 42 inches across, made of Marlex tubing with a wooden plug joining the ends, and they told the kids they could keep the hoop if they mastered it. Within minutes, children were spinning the rings around their waists with an ease that seemed to defy explanation. The motion was oddly hypnotic to watch. You either had it or you didn't, and if you had it, it looked effortless, and if you didn't, it looked like something worth acquiring. They went from playground to playground. They gave hoops away in neighborhoods. They required Wham-O executives to bring hoops with them on airplanes because they'd discovered that the moment someone saw a hula hoop, they wanted to know what it was and how it worked. The hula hoop went on sale in the spring of 1958 for $1.98. The craze began in July. By October, 25 million had been sold. By the end of 1960, more than 100 million worldwide, the first toy in history to sell that many units. What happened inside Wham-O's supply chain during those months was something close to controlled chaos. The company could not make hula hoops fast enough. They contracted with every plastics manufacturer they could find. At peak, they were working with more than 100 of them simultaneously. They set up overseas factories in Tokyo, London, Frankfurt, and Toronto. They drew on the Marlex from Phillips Petroleum until Phillips had to build new production capacity just to keep up. A plant superintendent in Titusville, Pennsylvania, a man named Robert Pooh, ran his 125 workers 3 shifts a day, 7 days a week, for months. There simply wasn't enough of anything. Not enough plastic, not enough workers, not enough trucks. At peak, Wham-O was producing 20,000 hula hoops per day. If you took the plastic tubing in all the hula hoops sold in those 2 years and laid it end to end, it would have circled the earth more than 5 times. Television amplified everything. This was one of the first great fads spread by the new national medium. Children demonstrating hula hoops appeared on local and network programs. Newsreel footage of children gyrating went worldwide. Foreign governments took notice. In Japan, the hoop was banned. In the Soviet Union, it was described with some apparent sincerity as evidence of the decadence of American culture. America, for its part, couldn't get enough, but there is a lesson buried inside the triumph, and it's a lesson that Wham-O should have learned and never quite did. When the craze died, and it died almost as suddenly as it came, Nur and Melin were left holding millions of hoops they couldn't sell. The knockoffs had moved fast. Since you cannot patent a plastic circle, any manufacturer with an extruder could make a hoop and undercut Wham-O's price. The market flooded with cheap imitations. The hula hoop mania collapsed, and with it went the margins. Wham-O ended 1958 with a net loss of $10,000. They had sold $45 million worth of hula hoops and lost money doing it. The surplus inventory piled up in warehouses. Millions of rings sat in stacks like gargantuan pastel bracelets, waiting for a second wave that wasn't coming. Nur would say later that the hula hoop had been born in January and dead as a doornail by October. But here's what they did next, and this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what Wham-O was at its best. They looked at the pile of leftover hula hoop plastic, and they kept going. Ed Hedrick looked at the Frisbee and decided it needed better ridges. Norman Stingley walked into their office with a black ball in his hand. A man named Robert Carrier had an idea about a garden hose and a strip of slippery vinyl. They kept going. They always kept going. Stand on the floor of the San Gabriel plant in 1965 and take it in. The smell hits you first. Warm polyethylene, faintly sweet, with an undertone of machine oil and the sharper bite of Zectron rubber curing in its molds. The air holds it, not an unpleasant smell, not the kind that makes you step back, but a smell that says production, says volume, says that this building is alive and working. The sound is constant, the rhythmic thump of the hoop-bending press at one end of the floor, shaping heated tubes into perfect circles, the hiss of pneumatics as packaging machinery seals flat-packed slip and slides into their yellow sleeves, the rattle of Superballs, hundreds of them at once, tumbling from a sorting drum into waiting bins, each one clicking against the next like a percussion section that never gets tired. Forklifts move between stations. Workers call to one another over the noise. Somewhere a radio plays. The color is extraordinary. Wham-O ran hot visually. The hoops came in electric pink and neon yellow and safety orange and swimming pool turquoise. The Superballs were jet black, but their packaging was eye-searing. The slip and slides were long yellow rectangles waiting to be unrolled on the lawns of America. Everywhere you looked in that plant, color, the visual language of summer stacked to the ceiling. Making a hula hoop is a process elegant in its simplicity. High-density polyethylene arrives at the factory as small pellets, uniform beads of material, no bigger than a pencil eraser, in whatever color the batch calls for. The pellets are fed into the hopper of an extruder, a machine that looks something like a very serious sausage maker. It heats the material through friction, adds pigments as needed, and forces the molten plastic through a die that shapes it into continuous tube. The tube emerges warm and soft, and in a step proprietary to Wham-O, it passes through a twist machine that wraps a contrasting color stripe in a slow spiral around the hoop, the visual signature of the product. Then a cut-off saw, much like a circular blade, slices the tube into the precise lengths needed for each hoop size. The ends are bent together and joined with a small wooden plug. Done. The whole process from pellet to finished hoop takes minutes. The simplicity is part of the genius and part of the vulnerability. If you could make a hoop in minutes, so could your competitors. Making a Superball is something else entirely. Norman Stingley was a chemical engineer at the Bettis Rubber Company in Whittier, California. He was working in his spare time in 1965. His employer had first right of refusal on any invention he made, so he'd offered it to them, and they'd said no, citing the material's tendency to crumble under hard use. They told him he was free to take it elsewhere. He walked into Wham-O's office with a small black ball and bounced it off the floor. floor. Knurr and Mellin watched it nearly hit the ceiling. The material Stingley had developed was a synthetic rubber he called Zectron. The name meant nothing, but it sounded like something out of a science fiction film, which was exactly the right register for 1965. Zectron was vulcanized at 165 degrees Celsius and formed under 3,500 pounds per square inch of pressure, the kind of force used to forge steel. The result was a ball with a coefficient of restitution of 0.92. In plain English, drop it from shoulder height, it bounces back nearly to your hand. Throw it down hard onto concrete and it will sail over a 3-story building. Knurr and Mellin wanted it badly, but the material still crumbled. So they sent Stingley back to the lab to fix it. Several weeks of testing later, Stingley returned with a ball that held together under real use. Wham-O introduced the Superball in the summer of 1965 at 98 cents retail. By December of that year, they had sold 6 million of them, a rate of roughly 170,000 balls per day at peak production. Across the decade of the 1960s, they sold 20 million total. George Bundy, Lyndon Johnson's national security advisor, ordered 6 Superballs shipped to the White House for his staff. The NFL commissioner's office was fielding calls from owners who wanted to name their new championship game after one. Lamar Hunt, the Kansas City Chiefs owner, who is generally credited with suggesting the Super Bowl name, later confirmed it was his daughter's Super Ball that gave him the idea. Inside the factory, the Super Bowl molds ran around the clock. The forming presses applied their 3,500 pounds of pressure in rhythmic cycles, releasing each ball from the mold with a soft pop. Workers collected them by the hundreds, checking for surface defects, sorting by color, funneling them into the packaging lines. And occasionally, inevitably, one would escape, would bounce off a workbench, carom off a wall, arc across the floor and disappear under a machine somewhere. Because a Superball in a factory building is essentially impossible to catch, the slip and slide came from a different place, from the domestic, the ordinary, the accidental. Robert Carrier was an upholsterer in California. He came home from work one afternoon and found his son sliding on the wet, painted concrete of their driveway, heading toward the street. He did what an upholsterer would do. He found a long strip of nauga hide, sewed a tube along one edge to accept a garden hose, punched holes in the tube at intervals to let the water spray out across the surface, staked it to the lawn, and watched his son slide. He eventually patented the idea and brought it to Wham-O, who replaced the nauga hide with plastic to bring the production cost down and introduced it at the 1961 Toy Fair. The slip and slide was simplicity itself, a long yellow sheet of thin vinyl, a garden hose, and a summer afternoon. You ran, you dove, you slid. The water made it frictionless, and the lawn made it forgiving, and it seemed like an object so benign it barely needed a warning label. It seemed that way for a long time. The workers who came through the gates at Westbrooks Avenue in those years were mostly from the San Gabriel Valley, a landscape of modest bungalows and backyard citrus trees, a working-class suburb that had grown alongside the sprawl of post-war Los Angeles. Some were second-generation Mexican Americans whose families had been in the valley since before the war. Some were white working-class transplants from the Midwest who'd followed the aerospace industry west and found work in the valley's secondary economy of light manufacturing. They ran the extruders and the packaging lines and the heat-sealing machines. They sorted product and stacked pallets and drove forklifts. They understood the rhythms of the plant the way longtime workers always do, the quirks of a particular machine, the way the extruder ran hotter in summer, the sound a mold made when it was about to need attention. There was a particular satisfaction, workers would say, in making something that children wanted. That's not a small thing. Most manufacturing is invisible to its end users. You make a component that becomes part of something else, and you never see the finished product. But a hula hoop is a hula hoop the moment it comes off the line. A Superball is recognizably itself the moment it drops from the mold. The workers in San Gabriel made whole things, finished things, things with a clear purpose that they could hold in their hands and understand completely. And outside the plant, those things were everywhere. The Frisbee on the college campus, the Hula Hoop on the evening news, the Superball in the White House. There was a quality to working at Wham-O that was genuinely unusual in American manufacturing. The company made joy measurably at industrial scale, and the workers got to feel the weight of that. Knurr and Mellin were not absentee executives. They were present. They went to playgrounds themselves. They required their management team to do the same, to get out into the field, to watch how children played, to see what caught and what didn't. The separation between the executive suite and the factory floor that defined so much of American corporate culture in this era was not, at Wham-O, particularly pronounced. Both founders had built this thing with their hands. Neither had forgotten that. The company's official motto was, "Keep it simple, stupid." The product line at any given time was no more than 8 to 12 items, all priced under $20, none with moving parts, none requiring batteries or instruction manuals or assembly beyond unrolling. The philosophy was almost monastic in its discipline. No complexity, no licensing deals for cartoons cartoon characters, no electronic gimmicks, just plastic and ingenuity and faith that the right idea would find its audience. The products were accessible in a way that matters. A hula hoop cost $1.98 in 1958. A Superball cost 98 cents. A Frisbee was $1 or $2. Families who couldn't afford the elaborate train sets and chemistry kits of the upscale toy market could afford a Wham-O product. The fun was not tiered. The town of San Gabriel felt the company's presence the way small cities feel the presence of a significant employer. Not completely, not like a mill town or a company town where the factory is the identity, but meaningfully. Wham-O wasn't San Gabriel's only employer, but it was among its more distinctive ones. A factory that made things children asked for by name, that manufactured objects people associated with happiness. The surrounding community of suppliers, contractors, and peripheral businesses understood that when Wham-O had a good year, when a product caught fire and the lines ran double shift, that good fortune rippled outward. The plastics contractors who supplied the hoops, the printing company that made the packaging, the shipping firms that moved the product east. And more than anything, there was the sense that what was being made at Westbrooks Avenue was by some measure important, not in a grand historical sense, not in the way that building jet engines or manufacturing steel rails or producing pharmaceuticals might feel important, but in a smaller, truer sense. Summer happened in part because of this address. There is a date that functions as a kind of summit for Wham-O. In 1974, the World Frisbee Disc Championships were held at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, California. Think about that for a moment. A sport that had not existed 20 years earlier, built on a plastic disc invented by a man selling out of his station wagon and redesigned by an ex-spy in an industrial park, had grown large enough and legitimate enough to hold its championship in one of the most famous stadiums in the country. Thousands of competitors, disc golf and ultimate and freestyle and guts, all the variants and disciplines that had grown up around the simple act of throwing a flat plastic circle. The Frisbee held 90% of the flying disc market. The Superball had named the Super Bowl. The Hula Hoop was selling a steady 1.5 million units a year, not the hysteria of 1958, but a durable, permanent piece of the American summer. The slip and slide was on lawns across the country. Silly string, introduced in 1969, was a perennial. The company employed roughly 1,000 workers at the San Gabriel complex, with thousands more at contractor facilities that produced to Wham-O's specifications. And beyond the numbers, the cultural position was extraordinary. Wham-O had made things that became part of the language, not just products, but words. You didn't throw a flying disc, you threw a Frisbee. You didn't bounce a super elastic ball, you bounced a Superball. The brands had become generic, which was both a mark of profound success and a warning sign that not everyone at Wham-O saw clearly. Richard Knurr, in a moment of characteristic directness, had once explained the Superball's physics this way. Each Superball bounce is 92% as high as the last. If our sales don't come down any faster than that, we've got it made. He was being wry, but there was a belief underneath the joke, a genuine belief that they had found a formula durable enough to sustain the company indefinitely. Simple toys, cheap plastic, constant rotation of new ideas, and the occasional fad that lit the world on fire. The formula had worked for 25 years. Why would it stop working? But stand at the summit of 1974 and look carefully, and you can see the first shadows of what was coming. Not clearly, not with the certainty that hindsight provides, but there if you knew what to look for. In homes across America, children were spending more time indoors. Atari had released Pong in 1972. The home video game was not yet a mass-market reality, but it was coming. The toy industry's highest margin, fastest-growing products were increasingly electronic, things that required circuit boards and power supplies and software. None of that was Wham-O's language. None of that fit their philosophy. And the lawsuits, the first slip and slide injury cases, were beginning to accumulate in courts. 7 adults and a teenager would eventually suffer broken necks or paralysis using the product. The first of those injuries dates to the early 1970s. The pattern was forming. It was not yet visible to the public, not yet a scandal, not yet the crisis it would become, but it was there, in court filings and medical records, and the quiet settlements that were beginning to cross the company's legal desk. And the founders themselves were getting tired. Knurr was in his late 40s. Mellin was past 50. They had spent a quarter century doing something they genuinely loved, and now, for the first time, you could see the weariness beginning. No sons or daughters waiting to take over. No obvious succession. Just 2 men who had built something extraordinary and were starting to wonder, perhaps for the first time, what they would do when they didn't want to do this anymore. The Rose Bowl was full of people playing a game they'd invented. The Superball was in the White House. The Hula Hoop was in the Smithsonian. They had made summer happen for a generation. What they hadn't made was a plan for what came next. There is a particular kind of vertigo that comes from standing at the top of something. You have climbed. The climb has cost you, and now you are here, and the view is extraordinary. And the temptation, the deep human temptation, is to believe that the view is the destination, that staying here is the same as getting here, that the formula that brought you to the top will also keep you there. By the late 1970s, Wham-O was experiencing that vertigo. The numbers still looked fine. Sales were growing steadily through the late 1970s, carried by the reliable Frisbee and the modest but consistent Hula Hoop, supplemented by a rotating cast of smaller products. The company was lean, expenses controlled by farming out manufacturing to contractors, and keeping the San Gabriel plant focused on labeling, packaging, and quality. 10 product lines, all under $20. The philosophy was intact, but the world around Wham-O had been changing for years, and the company had not changed with it. The toy industry of the late 1970s was not the toy industry of 1958. The post-war simplicity, the wooden toy, the tin truck, the plastic ball, had given way to something more complex and more expensive. Mattel and Hasbro were becoming empires, built on licensed properties, television advertising, and products that reflected the increasing sophistication of their young consumers. A 12-year-old in 1978 wanted something different from what a 12-year-old in 1958 had wanted, or at least was being sold something different. And then there were the screens. Atari had released Pong in 1972. By 1977, the Atari 2600 was in living rooms across the country. By the early 1980s, the home video game market was exploding, a billion-dollar industry seemingly built from nothing, selling products that required no backyard, no sunshine, no other children, no physical exertion, products that could be played in December as easily as in July, products with margins that made a 98-cent Superball look like charity. The toy industry followed the money. The Christmas season, always important, became the only season that mattered for the high-value products. Required summer and space and bodies, required summer and space and bodies in motion, was increasingly peripheral to where the industry was going. By the end of the 1970s, one industry observer wrote, Wham-O had settled into a strange sense of complacency. The funny product names had been exhausted. The stream of outside inventors with genuinely novel ideas had slowed. The last great hit, the Superball, was a decade old. The 1982 attempt to relaunch the Hula Hoop with peppermint-scented pink and white striped hoops failed to reignite any mania. The hoops sold reasonably. They did not sweep the nation. The deeper problem was structural, and Churned and Mellin understood it better than most people around them, because they had lived it with the Hula Hoop back in 1958. Fads are not businesses. A fad can fund a business, can give you the capital to build something more durable. But the fad itself is not the foundation. And the business that Churned and Mellin had built, for all its discipline and philosophical consistency, was still fundamentally dependent on fads to generate the peaks that sustained the valleys between. The Hula Hoop had been the great example. 100 million units, $45 million in revenue, and they'd ended the year in the red because the fad died faster than they could capitalize on it, because the product was too simple to patent, because knockoffs had flooded the market before they'd even finished counting their receipts. The Frisbee was different. The Frisbee had transcended fad status and become a genuine cultural institution. But the Frisbee was also a generic noun. Children across America were throwing what they called Frisbees, some of which were Wham-O products, and some of which were competitors' discs sold at a lower price point. Wham-O's 90% market share in flying discs was real, but it was under slow, constant pressure from below. And beneath all of this, the lawsuits were accumulating. The slip and slide had been on lawns across America for a decade before anyone at Wham-O publicly acknowledged that the product had a problem. The problem was physics, and it was invisible in the design. The toy was built for children, light enough, small enough, that when they dove onto the wet plastic surface and slid toward the end, their momentum was manageable. The water decelerated them gently. The lawn stopped them harmlessly. An adult was a different equation. A grown person's body carries significantly more mass and generates proportionally more momentum. When an adult dove onto a slip and slide, and the sudden friction of the end brought them to a stop, that momentum had to go somewhere. It went into the neck. The body's forward motion continued while the head did not. The cervical spine compressed. In the worst cases, and the worst cases were not uncommon, the compression shattered vertebrae and severed or crushed the spinal cord. Between 1973 and 1991, 7 adults and one 13-year-old suffered broken necks, quadriplegia, or paraplegia on the slip and slide. Wham-O knew this. They knew it before they sold the company. They knew it, and they stopped making the slip and slide quietly, without public announcement in the late 1970s. Not with a recall, not with a warning to the millions of families who still had slip and slides in their garages, but with a simple and quiet discontinuation. And then they sold the company. By 1982, both Churned and Mellin were in their late 50s. Mellin especially was tired. Tired in the specific way that founders get tired after 3.5 decades of building something with their hands. He wanted out. They had no children following them into the business. They owned 52% of the company's stock between them. They initially agreed to sell to Hasbro, Rhode Island's great toy consolidator, for $16.8 million. The deal fell apart. A month later, in September 1982, a San Francisco sporting goods company called Kransco arrived with an offer of approximately $12 million, and Churned and Mellin said yes. $12 million for the Frisbee, for the Hula Hoop, for the Superball that named the Super Bowl, for 34 years of summer. You can understand the logic. The brands were valuable, but the business was aging. The market was moving away from what Wham-O did. $12 million in 1982 was real money, and there was no obvious path to significantly more. You can understand it, and you can also feel the weight of that number, the sense that something was being undervalued in a way that the market couldn't fully measure. What the market couldn't measure was what those brands meant, not their licensing value, or their trademark protection, or their market share in flying discs. What they meant to the people who grew up with them. The Frisbee on the college lawn, the hula hoop in the backyard, the Superball disappearing over the neighbor's roof. That kind of meaning doesn't show up in a balance sheet. Churned and Mellin walked away. The company they had built from a saw from Sears belonged to someone else. Kransco was not a negligent company by the standards of its time and industry. It was a private San Francisco sporting goods firm that looked at the Wham-O portfolio and saw what any competent business analyst would see. Undervalued brands with decades of consumer recognition. The Frisbee, the Hula Hoop, the Superball, the hacky sack, which Kransco would acquire marketing rights to in 1983 and which would prove a genuine and durable hit. And then there was the slip and slide, sitting dormant. The reasoning for reviving it was not unreasonable. Millions of Americans had grown up with the toy. The warning system would be robust. Labels on the box, on the instructions, on the slide itself, not recommended for adult use. Warning, can cause injury if not properly used. The product had sold 9 million units without destroying the company. Children had used it for years without serious incident. What Kransco appears to have underestimated, or perhaps to have understood and accepted, was that a warning label does not change physics. In 1983, the slip and slide returned to store shelves. In 1987, a man named Michael Hubert was visiting his neighbor's property in Wisconsin. The neighbor had a slip and slide. It was summer. It seemed harmless. Hubert dove onto the slide and came to a sudden stop at the end. The momentum of his body drove his neck into the ground. He fractured his cervical spine. The case went to a jury in 1991. The verdict, $12.3 million. $10 million of that was punitive damages. The jury declared the slip and slide defective and unreasonably dangerous. The case was later settled for $7.5 million. 1 year earlier, in 1988, a University of Central Florida student named Robert Goldstein had broken his neck on a slip-end slide at a backyard gathering. His lawsuit would eventually produce a verdict of $1.6 million in 1995. Also in 1991, a 34-year-old California man named Bill Evans fractured his neck on a slip and slide and became a quadriplegic. His case was settled confidentially. The attorney who settled it, Matthew Rinaldi, wanted to issue a press release warning the public. Kransco's lawyers threatened legal consequences if he did. The confidentiality agreement, they said, prohibited disclosure. Rinaldi fought the gag order in court. By the time he was able to speak, months had passed. The warning he wanted to send had been delayed by lawyers protecting a company's legal exposure. In September 1991, after the $12.3 million Hubert verdict, Kransco's president wrote to the U.S., established that, at the time that letter was written, the company had not taken any corrective action. Established that, at the time that letter was written, Kransco's leadership already knew about nearly every serious spinal cord injury on record. They knew about the Wisconsin man who had fractured his neck. They knew about the California student. They knew about Bill Evans. 2 years after that letter, in May 1993, Kransco and the CPSC jointly issued a safety warning. 7 adults and 1 teenager had suffered paralysis or permanent spinal cord injury. One of the adults had since died. Kransco stopped making slip and slides in 1992, citing officially a loss of market share. There is a dimension to this story that sits uncomfortably with the documentary's emotional framework, a dimension that resists the eulogist's instinct towards sorrow and complexity and tragic error. The injuries that happened under Kransko were not the result of a flaw that nobody saw coming. Wham-O had seen it coming. They had discontinued the product in the late 1970s after the first wave of serious injuries, and they had sold the company without adequately disclosing the liability. Kransko had revived the product with warning labels, which is a legal strategy as much as a safety strategy, and when the jury verdicts came, the corporate response was to contain the information rather than expand it. Men and women were paralyzed. One died, and the primary institutional response was confidentiality agreements and letters to regulators arguing that no corrective action was required. The tragedy here is not simply that a product hurt people. Products hurt people. That's the irreducible reality of manufacturing at scale in a world of human variability and human recklessness. The tragedy is that the pattern of injury was known, that the information was managed rather than shared, and that the legal machinery of confidentiality was used to keep the warnings quiet, while the product continued to find its way into American backyards. The slip and slide returned to shelves in 1997 with an inflatable bumper pad at the end. It is sold to this day. The Kransko years ended in 1994 when Mattel arrived with a checkbook. Mattel was, at that point, the largest toy company in America. A $5 billion empire built primarily on Barbie and licensed characters and the sophisticated machinery of Christmas. They purchased Wham-O from Kransko for approximately $260 million. That number requires a moment of attention. $260 million from the same brands that Kenner and Mellon had sold for $12 million 12 years earlier. What had changed was not the underlying business. What had changed was the perceived value of the intellectual property, the trademarks, the brand equity, the cultural residue of decades of American childhoods. In 1982, the market couldn't fully price the meaning of Frisbee as a word in the American vocabulary. By 1994, it could, but Mattel, having paid that price, did essentially nothing with what it bought. Mattel was a company organized around complexity, around products with licensing fees and character rights and annual model updates, and the intricate machinery of keeping Barbie relevant through an ever-changing cultural landscape. Wham-O was a company organized around simplicity. The philosophies were not just different, they were incompatible. Inside Mattel, Wham-O became a small division with little internal championship. The product line was cut. Everything except the Frisbee, the Hula Hoop, and the hacky sack was essentially abandoned. The Superball disappeared from production. The innovation that had defined Wham-O at its best, the restless hunting for the strange and the new, the willingness to go to the playground and watch, had no institutional home inside a $5 billion corporation built on known quantities. 3 years after paying $260 million, Mattel sold what remained for $20 million. The buyer was the Charterhouse Group, an investment firm that organized a management buyout in December 1997, also acquiring Mattel's sports division. The total price, $20 million, plus the boogie boards and the Maury brands and the Churchill swim fins that came with the sports division, $20 million. From $260 million to $20 million in 3 years. Not because the brands had lost their meaning, but because the operating business had been allowed to wither inside a corporation that had no feel for it. There is a particular sadness in watching a company sold and resold, passed from hand to hand like an object nobody knows quite what to do with, but nobody wants to throw away. The names remain, the logos remain, the institutional memory, the sense of what the thing was, what animating spirit had made it matter, that erodes with every transaction. Charterhouse brought genuine intention to the revival. Their president, Michael Cookson, had ambitions: grow Wham-O to $300 million in revenue, building on the classic brands while acquiring new outdoor product lines. They bought surf brands, snow brands, ball companies. They brought back the Superball. In the first full year as an independent company again, revenue reached an estimated $50 million. But $50 million to $300 million is a large gap to cross, and they never crossed it. The relationship with the major chains, Walmart, Target, Kmart, was difficult. The toy retail landscape had consolidated around the demands of a handful of enormous buyers who wanted licensed products with marketing support that a $50 million company couldn't provide. Wham-O's low-price, low-complexity model was still viable, but it was viable at a scale that couldn't satisfy the ambitions of an investment firm. In 2002, Arthur Mellon died. He had been out of the company for 20 years, had watched it pass from owner to owner without being able to do anything about it, had seen the brands he'd built with his boyhood friend become line items in corporate portfolios portfolios. He was 78 years old. In January 2006, Wham-O was sold for approximately $80 million to Cornerstone Overseas Investment Limited. Cornerstone was a Chinese company that owned or controlled 5 factories in China. The manufacturing, what remained of American production, followed the sale overseas. The brands that had been made in San Gabriel, California, were now going to be made in Chinese factories at a fraction of the cost of American production. This was not unusual. By 2006, this was the story of American manufacturing writ large. The steady migration of production to lower-cost environments, the conversion of American companies into American brands licensing the right to manufacture to foreign producers. Wham-O was not special in this regard. It was representative, but representative doesn't mean painless. Representative means that millions of workers across hundreds of American industries experienced the same arithmetic at roughly the same time. And the accumulated weight of all those individual calculations, each one rational, each one defensible on its own terms, became the shape of the American economy in the early 21st century. The San Gabriel plant, remember, had already been gone for 19 years by then. Huifeng Foods had been making sriracha at West Brooks Avenue since 1987. The building Wham-O had outgrown, the complex where 1,000 workers had made summer happen for 30 years, had already been repurposed. The transition from plastic fun to hot sauce had happened quietly, in a real estate transaction, with no ceremony. Richard Knurr lived to see the Chinese sale. He died in January 2008, at 82 years old, of complications from a stroke. He had spent his final years in Arcadia, California, not far from the San Gabriel Valley where he'd grown up, where he'd gone to school, where he'd built a saw from a Sears installment plan and decided to make the world more fun. 3 years after he sold the company, he'd been asked what he thought of Wham-O's longevity, of the little slingshot business lasting 60 years. "Has it been that long?" he said. "Wow, Spud and I had a lot of fun doing what we did. We loved it." The ruins of the Wham-O story are not what you might expect. Open to the sky. The building still stands open to the sky. The building still stands at 1655 West Brooks Avenue in San Gabriel. The parking lot is full. The loading docks are busy. It smells of vinegar and chili peppers. The rooster on the sriracha bottle has replaced the slingshot on the Wham-O logo. Different hands now move through those 8 buildings. Different machines process different materials toward a different product. The same address, the same square footage, a completely different world. If you want to find the ruins of Wham-O, you have to look somewhere else. Look in a landfill. The 100 million hula hoops sold in 1958 and 1959 were made of Marlex, high-density polyethylene, which Phillips Petroleum had developed, and Wham-O had popularized, and which is technically recyclable, but was not in the late 1950s and early 1960s being recycled by anyone. Those hoops weighed roughly 10 ounces each. Do the arithmetic, and you arrive at something in the range of 60 million pounds of HDPE plastic, roughly 30,000 tons, that entered the American waste stream in a 2-year period, and is, with very few exceptions, still there. HDPE does not biodegrade, not in any meaningful human timeframe. It photodegrades, breaks down into smaller and smaller fragments under UV exposure. But those fragments persist. They are in the soil, they are in the water table, they will be there for centuries. The 9 million slip and slides, sold between 1961 and 1992, were thin PVC or vinyl sheeting, a material that is substantially more difficult to recycle than HDPE and that also doesn't biodegrade. They were, almost without exception, thrown away at the end of their useful lives, which were often a single season. They are in landfills too. The 20 million Superballs of the 1960s are made of Zectron, a synthetic rubber compound that has an excellent coefficient of restitution and a negligible coefficient of decomposition. They are in the ground. They will be in the ground when no one who ever bounced one is alive to remember it. The empire of fun became an empire of landfill, the miracle material of the post-war era, the plastic that could become anything, that could be a toy or a pipe, or a packaging material or a component in a jet engine, is permanent in a way that nothing made from it was meant to be. The hula hoop craze lasted 2 years. The plastic from those hoops will last 2,000. This is the specific quality of the ruins that Wham-O left behind. Not visible, not dramatic, not the photogenic decay of industrial abandonment, but vast and silent and underground, somewhere beneath a subdivision, or a nature preserve, or a shopping center parking lot in 1950s America. A pink hula hoop from 1958 is still perfectly circular, still the same color it was the day it came off the line in San Gabriel, unchanged by 65 years, unchanged by the bankruptcy of the company that made it, by the death of the men who built it, by the long chain of acquisitions that dissolved its soul. The plastic doesn't know any of that. The plastic simply endures. The brand endures too, in its way. You can buy a Wham-O Frisbee today. You can buy a Wham-O Hula Hoop Hoop and a Wham-O slip and slide and a Wham-O Superball. They are sold at Walmart and Amazon and sporting goods stores. They are made in China. The current corporate steward is the Aguilar Group, which acquired the brand in 2009 after the Cornerstone years. The Frisbee and the Hula Hoop and the Superball are in the National Toy Hall of Fame. Frisbee remains a genericized trademark. Wham-O maintains it, but cannot prevent people from using the word to mean any flying disc made by anyone. The word has escaped the brand. Ed Hedrick, the man who redesigned the Frisbee and built the organized sport around it, died in 2002. He had requested in advance that his ashes be pressed into a limited number of commemorative Frisbees and distributed to his family and close friends. It was done. Somewhere, a flying disc made of a man's remains is still, presumably, in the air. Fred Morrison, who invented the disc that became the Frisbee, died in 2010 at 90 years old. He had received royalties from Wham-O for 50 years. Norman Stingley, who invented the Superball in his spare time, received his royalties and became a wealthy man. Robert Carrier, the upholsterer who built the first slip and slide from a strip of Norga hide, sold his patent to Wham-O for a price that has never been disclosed. Michael Hubert, whose neck was fractured by a slip and slide in 1987, received $7.5 million in settlement after a jury awarded him $12.3 million. He had asked for the case to be settled long before it went to trial. His insurer had declined. Robert Goldstein received $1.6 million. Bill Evans, paralyzed in 1991, his settlement kept confidential, received an amount that was never disclosed and that no attorney was permitted to discuss. Here is what Richard Knurr would have told you near the end of his life about what Wham-O was. He would have said, "Fun, that's all. They wanted to make something fun." He wouldn't have said it with false modesty. He'd always known that fun was harder to make than it looked, that identifying the right idea and scaling it and putting it in the hands of children and watching it catch was a genuine skill that not many people had, that he and Spud had it in a measure that was probably not reproducible, that the 34 years they spent doing it were good years, were the years he would have chosen if he could have chosen. He said that he thought the country had given him more than he'd given it, that it had given him the opportunity, and it genuinely had. The post-war American economy, with its expanding middle class, and its rising consumer spending, and its new national television network spreading images of children playing from one coast to the other, was a system perfectly engineered to reward exactly what Knurr and Mellon were offering. Simple, cheap, brilliant fun. Things a family could afford. Things a child could master in an afternoon. Things that required no instruction manual, no power source, no specialist knowledge, only a backyard or a campus or a beach, or a summer afternoon with nowhere particular to be. They made 230 different products over the span of the company's American manufacturing life. Most failed. A handful succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. The Frisbee, the Hula Hoop, the Superball, the slip and slide, the silly string, the hacky sack, objects that became words, objects that became summers. 200 million Frisbees sold, 100 million Hula Hoops, 20 million Superballs, billions of afternoons. What was lost? Not the brands, not the trademarks, not the licensing agreements and the royalty streams and the corporate entities that shuffle those assets from one balance sheet to another. Those survive. They survive in a way that has nothing to do with what Knurr and Mellon were actually doing. What was lost was the thing that made the brands worth having. The restless, personal, irreducibly human process of two men going to the playground and watching how children played and coming back to the factory and saying, this is the next thing. We don't know why it will work. We just know that it will. That cannot be acquired. It cannot be transferred in a stock sale or protected by a trademark registration or recreated by an investment firm's management team, however talented. It lived in specific people, in the friendship between Knurr and Mellon that stretched back to boyhood, in the particular combination of their instincts, in the decades of experience they carried in their hands and eyes and gut. When they walked away in 1982, it went with them. The company kept the name. It kept the brands. It could not keep the thing that had made the brands. There is a building in San Gabriel, California that smells of hot sauce now. And somewhere below the soil of 1,000 American neighborhoods, below the lawns where children once dove onto wet yellow plastic on August afternoons, below the driveways where Superballs bounced over the garage roof and were never seen again, the plastic endures, patient, permanent, unchanged. It does not know what it was part of. It does not know that the company that made it has been sold 5 times and moved to China and reduced finally to a trademark in a corporate portfolio. It does not know that the men who built the factory that made it are gone, or that the factory itself now smells of vinegar and peppers and has a rooster where the slingshot used to be. It only knows how to last. What the plastic remembers, the people forgot, or were bought out of, or grew too tired to sustain, or could not find a way to hand to whoever came next. Two men wanted to make the world more fun. For 34 years, by any honest accounting, they succeeded. Summer happened because of them. Specific real summers. The one where your sister couldn't figure out the hula hoop and you could. The one where the Superball cleared the neighbor's fence and you never got it back. The one where the whole block ended up on the slip and slide at once and nobody wanted the afternoon to end. Those summers happened. They were real, and somewhere below the surface, in the dark and the quiet, 100 million plastic circles are waiting for a hoop mania that will never come again.